August 2014. The heart of America is burning, not in a sprawling metropolis, but in Ferguson, Missouri. A quiet suburb that suddenly became a war zone. Armored vehicles patrol streets where children used to play. Tear gas hangs in the air, thick and suffocating. A generation's anger has just exploded onto the national stage. And at the center of it all lies the body of a young man, left on the hot asphalt for 4 agonizing hours. He was 18 years old, unarmed. His name was Michael Brown. The man who shot him was a police officer named Darren Wilson. What happened in the 90 seconds between their first encounter and the final fatal shot? The answer depends entirely on who you ask. One side tells a story of a terrifying assault and a justified act of self-defense. The other tells a story of aggression, fear, and a surrender that was met with a volley of bullets. This case is not a simple whodunit. The killer was known from day one. The true mystery lies in a far, far more profound question. Why? Why did a routine stop for jaywalking escalate into a tragedy that would scar a nation? And how could the truth, seen by multiple eyes, fracture into 2 irreconcilable realities? This story forced America to look in the mirror, and the reflection was deeply unsettling. It gave birth to a phrase that would define a movement. Hands up, don't shoot. But what if that iconic image, that symbol of surrender, was not what it seemed? Welcome to our channel, where we explore the complex truths behind the stories that shape our world. If you believe that understanding requires looking beyond the headlines, take a moment to subscribe. Before the sirens, before the smoke, there were just 2 lives running on parallel tracks, unaware of their impending collision. The first belonged to Michael Brown Jr. To his family, he was the gentle giant, a quiet, introspective 18-year-old who had finally graduated high school days before. He was on the cusp of a new beginning, enrolled in a technical college, carrying the hopes of a family that saw him as the one who would build a different future. He loved music, dabbled in writing lyrics, and dreamed of being a business owner. But life is rarely so simple. In the final hour of his life, Michael Brown made a choice. He walked into a convenience store and, after an altercation, walked out with a box of cigarillos he hadn't paid for. It was a petty theft, a footnote in a young life. Officer Darren Wilson would not know about this incident when he encountered Brown minutes later. But this single act would later be used to paint a portrait of a thug, complicating the narrative of an innocent victim and muddying the waters of public opinion. The second life belonged to Darren Wilson. At 28, he was a 6-year police veteran. He didn't fit the stereotype of a rogue cop. Colleagues described him as a capable, even-keeled officer. His own past was marked by adversity. Raised by a single mother who was a convicted felon, Wilson chose a path of order and law, a direct repudiation of the chaos of his childhood. Yet his career path was not without its own shadows. Before Ferguson, he worked in Jennings, a neighboring police department, so plagued by racial tension and corruption that it was eventually disbanded. He was a product of a system that was already broken, a fact that would soon become tragically relevant. These 2 men existed in Ferguson, a town of 21,000 people with a deep, festering wound. Decades of white flight had transformed its demographics, leaving a population that was 2/3 black, governed and policed almost exclusively by white officials. This was a place where racial tension simmered just beneath the surface, a pressure cooker of mistrust between the community and the law enforcement paid to protect it. On August 9, 2014, under the blistering Missouri sun, these 2 men, products of their histories and their environment, were about to meet on Canfield Drive, and the pressure cooker was about to explode. High noon, Canfield Drive. A police SUV rolls to a stop beside 2 young men walking in the middle of the street. It's a trivial infraction, something that happens 1,000 times a day across America. But this time would be different. In the 90 seconds that followed, two versions of reality would be born, both forged in terror and ending in tragedy. In Officer Darren Wilson's telling, the confrontation was immediate and violent. He claims that as he tried to open his door, Michael Brown, an imposing figure at 6'4", slammed it shut and lunged at him through the open window. Wilson described a desperate struggle inside the claustrophobic confines of his vehicle, feeling like a 5-year-old holding on to Hulk Hogan. He says Brown struck him in the face and then, critically, went for his service weapon. A shot fired, then another. The struggle for a moment was over. Dorian Johnson, Michael Brown's friend and the only other person present for the entire encounter, tells a completely different story. In his version, Wilson's initial command to get on the sidewalk was aggressive. He claims the officer, still in his car, grabbed a hold of Brown by the neck, initiating a tug-of-war. Brown, terrified, was simply trying to pull away. The gunshots inside the car were not the result of a struggle for the weapon, but the act of an officer who had already lost control. In these few seconds, the truth splintered. Brown and Johnson ran. Wilson exited his vehicle and gave chase. And here, in the open street, the story fractures again, this time into the iconic image that would define the entire conflict. According to multiple eyewitnesses, Michael Brown stopped, turned, and raised his hands. It was a gesture of surrender, a plea. This was the moment that gave birth to the rallying cry, "Hands up, don't shoot." A narrative of a young, unarmed man attempting to give up, only to be executed in the street. But Officer Wilson's account paints a chillingly different picture. He states that Brown stopped, but did not surrender. Instead, he turned and, with what Wilson described as an aggressive, almost inhuman expression, began to charge back towards him. For Wilson, this wasn't surrender. It was a final, terrifying assault. He raised his pistol. A series of shots rang out. Then another series. He kept firing. He would later testify, until the threat was neutralized. Michael Brown fell, face down on the pavement. The legal battle that followed was as divisive as the shooting itself. In November 2014, a grand jury was tasked not with determining guilt, but with deciding if there was enough evidence to even charge Darren Wilson with a crime. They heard from 60 witnesses and reviewed thousands of pages of evidence, including the crucial autopsy report. It confirmed Brown was struck at least 6 times, all to the front of his body, a fact that, paradoxically, could support either narrative. Was he facing Wilson to surrender or to charge? After months of deliberation, the decision came down. No indictment. The grand jury found Wilson's account of self-defense to be credible. The U.S. Department of Justice, under Attorney General Eric Holder, launched its own exhaustive investigation. Their conclusion, released in March 2015, was the same. They found no evidence to disprove Wilson's belief that he feared for his life. Critically, their report stated that many of the eyewitness accounts supporting the "hands up, don't shoot" narrative were inconsistent with the physical evidence, or were later recanted by the witnesses themselves. Legally, the case was closed, but for America, the wounds had just been torn open. The resolution, when it cheeks to Abba, was not a bomb, but gasoline poured on an open flame. On the cold evening of November 24th, 2014, the St. Louis County prosecutor announced the grand jury's decision to a world holding its breath. No indictment. Darren Wilson would not face a single criminal charge. The official narrative was sealed. The officer had acted in self-defense, his fear of death deemed reasonable. But on the streets of Ferguson, those words were not an explanation. They were an ignition. The breath the city had been holding was released in a torrent of fire and fury. The protests, which had simmered for months, erupted into the most violent nights yet. For this community, the legal system had not delivered justice. It had confirmed their deepest fears, that the life of a young black man was worth less, that the word of an officer was insurmountable, And what of the man at the center of the storm? Darren Wilson was now legally a free man, but he was free only in name. He had won the legal battle, but in the court of public opinion, he was a marked man, a symbol of a national sickness. Just days after the grand jury's decision, he resigned from the Ferguson Police Department. He stated it was the hardest thing he'd ever had to do, but that he was stepping down to protect his fellow officers and the community from further harm that his continued presence would inevitably cause. And then he vanished. He went into hiding, moving from house to house, unable to find work in law enforcement again. He was erased from the life he had known, forever defined by 90 seconds on a hot summer day. While Wilson retreated into anonymity, the Brown family was thrust permanently into the spotlight. Their resolution was not one of private grief, but of public purpose. Their son was gone, and the man who killed him would never face a trial. For them, there was no closure. Instead, their pain was transformed into a relentless pursuit of a different kind of justice, a fight to change the very system they felt had failed them. The final bitter irony of the resolution came from the Department of Justice. While it cleared Wilson of civil rights violations in the shooting itself, a second separate report was a damning indictment of the entire city of Ferguson. It uncovered a predatory system of policing and a municipal court that disproportionately targeted African Americans, not for public safety, but to generate revenue. It was a stunning validation of the community's outrage. The report concluded that while Darren Wilson may not have been a rogue killer, he was an agent of a system that was fundamentally racially biased. There was no single monster to slay, but a hydra with many heads. A single death can be a tragedy. 1,000 deaths can be a statistic, but sometimes a single death becomes a symbol, a flashpoint that illuminates a truth a nation has tried to ignore. The legacy of Michael Brown is not found in the old hard text of a legal document, but in the seismic shift he caused in the American conscience. His death was the spark that turned the embers of discontent into a raging inferno. The most immediate legacy was the explosive growth of a movement, Black Lives Matter. While the phrase had been coined a year earlier, Ferguson transformed it from a hashtag into a global force for social change. Michael Brown's name became a rallying cry, joining a sorrowful litany of others, Trayvon Martin before him, and Eric Garner, Freddie Gray, Philando Castile, and George Floyd in the years that followed. The events in Ferguson forced a conversation that America had been avoiding for decades. It was a raw, uncomfortable, and deeply necessary dialogue about systemic racism, police brutality, and the two Americas that so clearly exist within one nation. The phrase "hands up, don't shoot" became the movement's most potent and most contested symbol. Even after the Department of Justice concluded that the hands up narrative was likely untrue based on forensic evidence, the power of the image endured. For millions, it ceased to be about the literal final moments of Michael Brown. Instead, it became a powerful metaphor for the vulnerability and the perceived lack of humanity afforded to Black bodies in encounters with law enforcement. It symbolized a plea for recognition, a demand to be seen as a human being first and a suspect second. The case also gave birth to another, more controversial concept, the Ferguson effect. This theory posited that in the wake of the intense scrutiny and public backlash against police, officers became more hesitant, less proactive in their duties, for fear of becoming the next Darren Wilson. This depolicing, the theory goes, led to a spike in violent crime in many American cities. While the existence and extent of this effect are still hotly debated by criminologists, it highlights the profound chilling effect the case had on law enforcement, creating a crisis of confidence and morale that rippled through departments nationwide. Perhaps the most enduring legacy of Ferguson is the simple, undeniable proof of how two people can look at the same set of facts and see two completely different worlds. For some, the story of Michael Brown is a cautionary tale about defying police orders, a tragedy brought on by a young man's poor decisions. For others, it is the story of a system that profiles, harasses, and ultimately kills with impunity. The truth, as is often the case, may lie somewhere in the murky, uncomfortable space in between. Michael Brown was not a saint. Darren Wilson was not a monster. They were two flawed human beings, products of their environment, caught in a system far bigger and more broken than either of them. And in their tragic collision, they held up a mirror to America, forcing us all to confront the reflection staring back. And so we are left here, in the quiet aftermath, with more questions than answers. The story of Michael Brown and Darren Wilson is not a neat parable with a clear moral. It is a tangled, tragic, and profoundly human story that resists easy categorization. There are no heroes, only victims of a collision that was perhaps in some ways inevitable. A collision between two individuals, two histories, and two Americas. This case forces us to confront uncomfortable questions that go to the very heart of our society. Where does personal responsibility end and systemic failure begin? At what precise moment does an officer's legitimate fear, forged in the dangers of their profession, cross the line into an unreasonable use of deadly force? When a story, a phrase like "hands up, don't shoot," becomes a powerful symbol for a larger truth, how much does its literal, factual accuracy matter? And perhaps the most difficult question of all, what does justice truly look like in a case where a life is lost, another is forever altered, and an entire community is left fractured and mistrustful? These are not questions with simple answers. The purpose of revisiting this story is not to retry Darren Wilson or to sanctify Michael Brown. It is to understand the forces that brought them to that street on that day, and to grapple with the legacy they left behind. The comments section below is a space for that dialogue. We ask that you engage with respect, listen to perspectives that may differ from your own, and contribute to a conversation that seeks understanding, not victory. What part of this story resonates most with you? What lessons, if any, can we draw from the tragedy of Ferguson? Thank you for joining us on this difficult journey. Our goal is always to explore the complex humanity behind the headlines. If this story provided you with a deeper perspective or made you think, please consider sharing it with someone who might also find value in the conversation.